It's great to come to Christ who has open arms for you. Like I said, you come desperate, you come empty. There are no cliques in the family of God. There is nobody who is above or beneath. There's equal ground through Christ. Olive Baptist, thank you for our church family, for the love, support, and prayers you've shown my family in the past few weeks. We appreciate the food, prayers, and time that was given both for my grandpa's passing and for my mother-in-law, Elaine Connor's funeral. We know both are in a much better place with our Lord and Savior. Love the Connor family. If you remember a few weeks ago, we're back in Exodus now. We took a couple of weeks off. We're back to looking at Moses, but probably maybe the message we had before we took a little break there for Easter, I told you about a slab of marble that was brought to a cathedral in Italy there, and this city was wanting to become the art capital of the world at that time and be known as that center. And I told you about that slab of marble that Michelangelo carved that we call the David today, that you know as that statue that he called that. Well, on May the 14th of 1504, around midnight, 49 men set out to bring that statue, to roll that statue around from the back of the cathedral to put it into its new home, to bring it to its new place where it would be displayed. It was 19 feet tall and it weighed 6 tons. It took them 5 days for those 49 men to pull it, to put it into position. After Michelangelo, he had been working on that thing for 3 years it took. You remember the original guy said he wouldn't work on it because the thing had fallen over and it had a crack in it, and he said it was flawed. But Michelangelo said, I see something in there, that the David was in there. All he had to do was be chipped out, hewn out. Well, when he was finished with that sculpture and it was in place, there was something that everybody noticed about it. And they noticed that David's hands were out of proportion. They were much larger than the proportion of the rest of the statue. Now, he did that, Michelangelo did that because he wanted everybody to know that it was his hands that made this sculpture, that made this piece of art. Well, that piece of art was designed, was meant to bring glory to God, but Michelangelo was saying, hey, this brings glory to God, but my hands did it. That's what he was saying through this. It was like he was saying, look at my ability, look at my talent. This is for the glory of God, but it's my hands that did this work of art. Well, that's kind of Moses in Exodus chapter 2 and chapter 3. That's why he's in the desert. That's why he is in the desert. He has taken it upon himself. You remember how he got in the desert? He had taken it upon himself to do something, to venture out, to take a stand on his own. That's what he was doing. He was taking a stand on his own, and his brethren, the Hebrews, they didn't like it. They said, what are you going to do, kill us too? And Pharaoh didn't like it either, and Pharaoh wants to kill him. So Moses has been on the run. And he's been on the run for what will be 40 years. So he tried to do something on his own, in his own ability, to say, hey, look, this is my ability, this is my talent. And he finds himself, remember, he found himself on the bench. Moses found himself on the bench, red-shirted. He found himself on the sideline. But what God has been doing with him while he was on the sideline was he was trying to teach him something. He was giving him instruction in things. So now we get to the point where God is going to call Moses off of the bench. He's going to put him in the game. You know, Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. And that's where he's at. He's been ready. He was ready. He thought he was ready. But we're going to find out that he's got some apprehension about God calling him in and putting him in the game. So Exodus chapter 3, verse 2. Well, I believe we've already read this verse, but let's look back and bring us up to full speed. Moses is out in the wilderness. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. Now, like I told you before, most theologians believe that this is the pre-incarnate Christ right here, who is actually speaking to Moses through the bush. Verse 3 and 4, so Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Now, we should find it interesting that God led him to this particular place in the wilderness. Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years, but God leads him to this particular place. Moses, who would have been one of the most educated men in Egypt. Why could we say that? How can we say that he could have been the most educated? Because he trained at Pharaoh's University. He trained at PU, right, or Egypt University. He trained in the palace there. He had all of the resources that royalty would have available to them, and we're sure that Moses was in touch and utilized those resources. So here he is, possibly the most educated man, the most well-learned man in all of Egypt. He's out here in the wilderness, and even though he came from one place of position to now he's in a place of obscurity, do you know who has been watching him the whole time? God has. God's had his eye on him the whole time. So whatever your condition is, whatever your situation is, you say, well, yesterday, last year was a good year, 10 years ago was a good time, but now these days and this time is just meaningless. There's no fruit in this time. God still has his eye on you. God is still aware. God still knows where you're at, even if you feel like you yourself are in a wilderness and it's been an extended period of time. God knows. God's eye is on Moses. It's on you as well. Verse 5. And he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. So God calls him, in verse 4 there, God calls him by name, Moses, Moses. He responds, and now God is going to give him some instruction as well. Verse 7. The Lord said, God has called him by name. He says, remove your feet. Where you're standing is holy ground. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. So God says, my eye is on them. I've seen the situation. Not only has God seen Moses, his situation, but he has seen the people in Egypt as well. For the centuries before and for these 40 years, nothing has escaped him. I've seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters. For I am aware of their suffering. So God says, I'm aware of it. I'm fully informed about what is going on here. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. So God says, my eye has been on them. I'm aware of what's going on. I see the suffering from the taskmasters. I see the oppression that they are under. He says, I'm going to drive out. He says, not only am I aware of what their situation is, he says, I'm aware of the situation in the place that they need to go. God is preparing a place for them to go. Right now, God is at work for you. Right now, God could be preparing something for you to enter into, for you to be invested in, for you to minister in, to serve in, maybe an occupation, maybe a position or whatever. God is at work right now on your behalf for you, doing something for you, and you do not realize it. God is at work right now. He was at work for them. He knew. He said, Moses, he says, I see your situation. My eye's on you. Not only is my eye on you, but my eye has been on Egypt as well during these last few decades. Not only that, but I know where I want to send you, and I know what must be done before you even get there. So God's aware. God's aware for you too. So God is going to drive out these 6, 7 nations right here, these 6 or 7 nations that are living off of this land. So God calls out to Moses. He says, hey, there's these nations. They're living off this land that's flowing with milk and honey, this land that is abundant, this land that is green, this land that has vegetation in it. He says, there's 6, 7 nations living off that right now. He says, so I'm going to move them out. And Moses, don't you know that I can sustain surely that one nation I will sustain marvelously. Verse 9. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. So God says, again, it says, Moses, I know what's going on. I see their predicament. As God spoke this, Moses, as God spoke this, Moses might have been thinking, hey, that's right, God, you see it. You've seen the affliction of the people in Egypt. You've heard their cry. You know the sufferings from the taskmasters. You know that you need to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians. You know the oppression. You know how they are oppressing them greatly. Moses is probably thinking, yes, God, you go, God, you do this. You take care of this. You make it right. Verse 10. Therefore, God says, since I've seen all that's going on, I've heard their cry, I know they're oppressed, I know they're suffering, I know the pain that they're in. Therefore, since all of this that I know, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh. What do you think Moses said? Let's put the brakes on this, God. This isn't what I had in mind, God. This was not in my playbook. I've been on the sideline, but I didn't think this is what you were going to call me to do. Can I already just be in the promised land and wait for them to get there? Can I go ahead and just set up camp ahead of them and start with the milk and honey for myself already? And you just bring them out, God. You do this on your own. Moses could have said, well, God, I've already been there. I've already been there once. And God, don't you remember? It didn't go very good. It didn't go real well the last time I was there. The wheels kind of fell off of the thing. But God says, you come now, I will send you to Pharaoh. God, you're right. You're right. Somebody needs to help them. Somebody needs to relieve them from the oppression. That happens in church too. People can say, God, you're right. Somebody needs to do something. Somebody needs to do something for this age group or that age group or this group of people. Somebody needs to do something for them. Yeah, God, there needs to be some leadership. There needs to be some innovators in that church right there. But don't ask me to serve. Don't ask me to sacrifice, God. Yeah, you're right. There needs to be something done over there at that place. But don't you dare ask me to give of my time or my talents to do that. See, we try to figure out ways. We spend a lot of effort trying to figure out ways so we don't have to serve God. And Moses here, he's going to give God about 5 or 6. He's going to give God about 5 or 6 different reasons, arguments, why he should not be that person to lead. Don't worry, we're only going to look at about 2 of them this morning, okay? Verse 11. Moses says to God, here's going to be the first argument right here. Who am I? See, that's what we would say too. God says, hey, I need somebody to take control, take charge. I need somebody to do this in this little local body of Christ right here. What do we? Well, who am I? Who am I, God? God, you got the wrong number. You misdialed. You called the wrong person up. So he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? So Moses again saying, God, I've already tried this. God, I was embarrassed. God, I was humiliated. God, I was a failure. God, don't you remember I failed? I ran. I'm not going back there. I've tried that before. I'm not going back there. Look at chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 1. Moses has asked God, he said, who am I, God, that I should do this? And God's going to show him. Chapter 4, verse 1. Moses said, well, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. Moses said, who am I? And what am I to tell them? Who am I to tell them who I am? The Lord, they're going to say, the Lord has not appeared to you. Why should we believe or listen to you? So Moses said, who am I? They're going to say, the Lord has not spoken to you. So Moses is basically saying, God, I'm of little value. I'm of little significance in your economy, God. I don't amount to much at all. Verse 2, the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. Now this is a good question, and there's more to this than just a piece of wood in his hand. So let's look at this for just a moment. God said, what's that in your hand? Now Moses could have been thinking, well, about 40 years ago in my hand, I had all the power of Egypt in my hand. About 40 years ago in my hand, I had all the possessions. I had all the riches. I had all the glory of Egypt in my hand. About 40 years ago in my hand, I was ready to be the next Pharaoh. And some say that Moses was being groomed to be that next Pharaoh. So Moses could have said, hey, in my hand, a few decades ago, I had the whole world. I had power and I was eating on golden plates. That's what I had in my hand, God. But now he answers and he says, I have a staff. You know what that staff meant for him? That staff, it wasn't much, and we don't think, all we think of it as a piece of a stick, but that staff was all he had left. That staff was a symbol. It represented his flock. It represented his wealth. It represented his possessions. It represented his family. That staff represented all that he had. So Moses has said, who am I? And how am I to respond to them? They're going to say, God has not spoken to you. So Moses is clinging on to something. He's clinging on to his possessions. He's thinking about himself. Who am I? God says, serve. You say, who am I? God calls you to serve in ministry. You say, God, you got the wrong number. God calls you to minister to somebody at Walmart, at the gas station, at the grocery store. God calls you to some little something. You say, you got the wrong number, God. I'm not the right man or woman or child or senior to do this. You're holding on to that staff. You're holding on to what you think you are. Then next, verse 6 here, chapter 4. Moses was thinking about himself. The Lord furthermore said to him, now put your hand into your bosom. Now what does that mean? He's going to slip it. It's like slipping it into your shirt, right over your heart. Now slip your hand into your bosom. Place it right over your heart. So he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Now this could have possibly been the Hebrew kind of leads you to assume that his hand was in the last stages of leprosy, so much so that the fingers were hanging on by a thread, that they were about to fall off. Now, leprosy in the Bible is a sign of sin. Leprosy is a sign of sin, and his hand has just been by his heart. So he's been clinging on to his staff, his possession, and now God has said, put your hand by your heart, pull it out, and see what it looks like, and it resembles sin. It resembles sin. So by his heart, his hand being by there, God is saying, hey, you've been out here for 40 years, but you've still got some issues in your life. Anybody still got issues in your life? You say, I've been saved for 40 years, but I still got issues in your life. Moses still had issues in his life. He was gripping his possession, and he had sin in his heart. Maybe he had bitterness, maybe he had resentment, maybe whatever it was that was in his heart. As he pulls that hand out, God displays, hey, you're not fixed. You're not complete. I've got work to do on you. There's still work to do. But see, we have the foresight to know that in this story, now this is amazing. Now listen to this right here. If this is all you pick up out of this, Moses is clinging to what he has. God has shown him, you still have some issues in your life. A staff in a hand, right? A staff in a hand. With foresight, what do we know that Moses did with his hands? When there was a war, what did Moses do? He held his hands up. What did God do? They won. They were victorious. When Moses came to the Red Sea, what did he do with that staff? Raised that staff up. Waters parted. God still used his hands and that staff. See, you're still worth something. You're not insignificant. You're not of minimal value or no value to God. God showed Moses, hey, you're clinging to something. You still have something wrong with you. You still got stumbles. You still have shortcomings. You still have falls. You still backslide. But I'm still going to use those hands and that staff. And then in God's even further foresight, God knew that Moses was going to have trouble with his hands and that staff again, because what happened? He struck a rock, didn't he? God said, speak to the rock, and out of anger, Moses struck the rock. So God said, hey, you've still got some problems. I still want to use you. And I know you're going to fall again. How about that? So when God calls, you don't say, who am I? I'm of no value. I'm a failure. I've tried it before. You listen to God. God already knew that. He knows today, and He knows what you're going to do tomorrow. Come back to chapter 3. Verse 13 and 14. Moses said to God, behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me. Now Hebrew scholars say that God covered it all. When he spoke I am right here, it meant I was, I am, and I always will be, has sent me to you. That's who sent me. So here's the next thing. The next thing that God is going to tell him and show him, he's going to show him what he's going to do. Verse 17 and 18. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing of milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say, and you, with the elders of Israel, will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Now the issue with Exodus, we think about Exodus right here and we think this is the story of them leaving Egypt. Well, the Hebrews, their original intention, their original request was to worship. Exodus is about worship. Their original request was to worship, and that's what the book is about. It's about worshiping God. So God says, you tell Pharaoh that the people are going to come a 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship me. Verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So God knows. He says, Moses, he says, you're going to go in there and you're going to make this request from the king, from Pharaoh. And I already know what Pharaoh's going to say. So Moses, I'm going to give you a heads up right here. You're going to go in, you're going to have this request. Pharaoh's not going to meet it. But don't worry, Moses. Don't fall apart. Don't get frazzled. Don't get bent out of shape when you speak to Pharaoh. See, the good thing is God already knew what was going to happen. So he's telling Moses, he says, just be patient. Be calm when you go in there. See, when you have a medical test, when you have a result that you're waiting on some results, God already knows. God already knows the outcome. God already knows what path you're going to need to take. You have a job interview, you're wondering how that job interview is going to go. God already knows. God already knew what Pharaoh was going to say to Moses. God already knows what you're going to do this week. You have a school decision to make. God already knows. God already knows the outcome of that. God can look ahead 1 year, 4 years. God can look infinitely ahead in your life. See, your predicament has not just dawned upon God this morning. God did not just wake up this morning and say, oh, look what they're going to go through today. God is not surprised by where you were last night, today, or tomorrow. He is not caught off guard by any time somebody calls you with bad news. Your bad news did not catch God off guard. God is not surprised about anything. Verse 20. So since the king will not permit you, there's going to need to be compulsion. There's going to need to be reason. So I'll stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. He says, so God says, I've seen it. This is what's going to happen. And at the end of this, they're going to be glad to let you go. So don't fall to pieces in the midst of your situation. See, the good thing is that He doesn't just deliver us from one situation and drop us off in a stickier situation. God does not deliver from one predicament and drop you. He doesn't deliver from the fire and drop you off into the frying pan or whatever that thing is. That's not the way God does. Chapter 4 now. God tells Moses, he says, if all of that is not enough for them, verse 8 and 9, if they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of the last sign. But if they will not believe even these 2 signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. Now see, what they thought was that life came from the Nile. They thought that they worshiped the Nile. They thought life came from the Nile. They thought life evolved. I've told you this before. They were evolutionists before they were evolutionists. They thought that things just, little white worms just kind of morphed out of the mud there, and they grew into to life that they saw in that day, what they saw right then. So they thought life came from there, and they worshiped it. So God is saying, hey, you take that water, you pour it onto the ground, and I'm going to turn it into blood. And that was a sign of judgment is what that was. It was a sign it was a showing of God being God over life. So God was bringing judgment upon them through that sign. Another time that God's judgment was poured out. There's another time that God's judgment was poured out, and this time it was at Calvary. This time there was living water that was poured out. And that living water became blood. And God said, I will deliver you with this. I will save you with this living water that is blood. If you come to that, what God said, He said, if you come to that living water, you will be covered under the blood of my Son, because His blood was poured out for your judgment. My Son will take what you should have been, how you should have been judged. That judgment will be heaped and cast upon Him, and He will bear that if you come to this living water. So if you accept that, if you believe that to be true for your life, you will have that experience that what should have been yours will not be yours, because it was cast upon His Son. And that living water is now blood for you, and it covers your sin. So He says, come. God says, come to the living water. So God shows Moses, He says, if they will not believe this, He says, then you take what they think is God to them, and I'm going to show that I am God over that I rule over that I'm in charge of all of creation, and I set things into motion. See, isn't it good to know that God had foresight and said, hey, this is what's going to happen, and this is how you respond. This is what you need. This is what I'm going to provide. I'm going to provide those needs in your life. I'm going to meet those needs. Moses, you're concerned. You've asked me questions. You've asked, who am I? What shall I say? And God has answered him. God has shown, and this is what's applicable for you, so that you know in your life that God's eye has been on you, that He has been watching you, that you are not absent from His sight, that there is no place that you can run to or flee to that He does not see you. God's eye was on Moses the whole time. It was on Egypt the whole time. It was on everybody else. Maybe that's what you need to hear this morning. I don't feel like God's eye is on me anymore. I'm going through something. I've been in something. I've been involved. This situation that I live in right now, the turmoil in the household that I live in, or I don't have anybody that I live with, and I just feel all alone right now. God's eye is on you. He's aware of what's going on in your life. He knows your need. I'm going to ask you to bow your head. Stand with us this morning, and I want to sing this last song. Maybe that's what you need to hear for yourself, that God sees you. You feel that you've escaped God's eyesight. Maybe God is calling you. Maybe He's calling you to that place of holy ground where He says, I want to sanctify you. I want to set you apart. I want you to be more like my Son. Maybe God is calling you today for salvation. Calling you to holy ground this morning. Maybe you've been giving excuses for all kinds of things in your life. You've got more excuses than there are minutes in the day. You have so many excuses, you believe them yourself to be truth for you. And God says, I've called you to serve. I've called you for this time. Is He calling you to something today? Is He calling you to holy ground? Is He calling you to be set apart, to repent, to turn away from maybe that what grips you? there's some need that you have this morning, if you'd like to pray over it here at the altar, I invite you to do that. I'll join with you in prayer. Feel free to share that with me, and I can join you, or just tell me it's unspoken. God knows, and we'll pray together. You want to come by yourself and pray? You want to lift up somebody else in prayer? Now is the time.